Hi everyone, Miss Gooch here, and this is a video all about the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen. So Wilfred Owen himself was a soldier in World War I, and he fought between 1915 and 1916 when he was sent back to Britain to be treated for shell shock, which is what is now known as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It wasn't as well understood then as it is now. A lot of the time soldiers were thought to be faking it, and there wasn't a great understanding of mental illness. So he did get a very good treatment, and he was actually told that he didn't have to go back to the war because his condition was so bad, but he did decide to return to the trenches. He felt bad leaving his men. There's a lot of survivor's guilt that he was dealing with. And sadly, he died on the 4th of November 1918, which is just 7 days before the end of World War I. So he just missed the end of the war by 1 week after surviving for nearly 3 years. Very tragic. And Exposure was written in the winter of 1917, so quite close to the end of the war, and it focuses on the real and arguably the deadlier enemy the soldiers had to face, which was the weather. So it's all about the cold weather and how awful it was to live in those conditions. So how does this poem link to conflict? Obviously it is a poem directly about war, and the poem really questions the purpose of war and presents its futility. Futility just means pointlessness, and it also conveys the power of nature. So like I said, what is deadlier to the soldiers in this poem is the snow, the cold weather, the winter. Okay, let's read the poem together then, so follow along. Our brains ache in the merciless ice east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low, drooping flares confuse our memories of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn, massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew, we watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we doze, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice, the house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore not loath, we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight his frost will fasten on this mud on us, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party picks and shovels in the shaking grass, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. Alright, so quite a long poem, and we're going to break this down 2 stanzas at a time. So starting here with this image of that merciless ice east wind. So this is opening with the idea of the danger coming from the weather. And it's interesting to note about the title actually. So exposure could mean exposure to the weather, or it could mean that Wilfred Owen, he's trying to expose the war. Okay, he's trying to tell people the true realities of what is going on, expose the truth to them. So there's a nice double meaning there, and we straight away see one of these meanings here about how they're exposed to the wind, they're attacked constantly by the wind. And in this second line, this is a very interesting phrase, we keep awake because the night is silent. So you would imagine normally with silence it's easier to sleep, but for these soldiers it says here they're worried by silence, and you can imagine that silence would, you just wait for the next thing to happen, the next attack, or the next bombing, or the next bullets being, you know, shot at them. So that's why silence there is worrying. And then moving into our next stanza, we keep talking about the weather, about the wind here, the mad gusts that are tugging on the wire, and this is the why they're talking about this barbed wire, and this was running down the centre of no man's land. And then we have this really awful, gruesome image here of the agonies of men among its brambles. So this, when men were, you know, crossing over no man's land, they would get trapped in this wire and then be shot, and then they'd twitch there and kind of die. So this is a really horrible image, and actually the fact that this speaker looks out at that wire moving in the wind and sees that probably shows that they are quite traumatized by it. And it ends this stanza by saying, what are we doing here? That questioning there. And if we think about how this poem is trying to expose the truth of war, well, that really shows you there, that's how these soldiers are feeling. What are we doing here? You know, why this was written 3 years into the war that they said would end by Christmas of the first year. So that is a really big question, and it's a really powerful way to end that stanza. And then we come here, the poignant misery of dawn. So you think about dawn, morning, normally it's like a new day, full of hope, full of life, full of sunlight, but for them it's miserable. And all they can think about every new morning, all they know is the war's still going on, they're soaked with rain, and there's clouds above that are threatening a storm. So there's nothing positive about the dawn for these people, for these soldiers. And it says there, this powerful line that's repeated the whole time, but nothing happens. So that waiting around in the war, we'll talk about this line a bit more later on. And then we have the sudden successive flights of bullets that streak the silence. So notice that repeated S sound as I say it, almost makes it sound like reflect the sound of the bullets streaking through the silence. But they say it's less deadly than the air. So how ridiculous is that? These bullets are flying towards them at random, suddenly out of nowhere, but the more deadly thing for them is the air. So that's that kind of, that fear of the snow, showed as black with snow, that's the deadly thing to them, not these bullets. And this part here is kind of moving towards a flashback. So it talks about how the snow comes towards them and all they can do is just cringe and hold back on forgotten dreams. So all the dreams they had about what they might do with their futures have been forgotten, and all they're doing now is just sitting in a hole, essentially staring, drowsy, dozed, snow dazed, almost like they even feel like they're in a dream or a nightmare maybe. And they say, is it that we are dying? They don't even know anymore. Are they alive? Are they dead? They're just freezing, I would imagine. And this here, this is a bit of a flashback. So slowly our ghosts drag home. So this ghost, whether that's because they think that they'll die and the only way that they'll go home is if they are ghosts, or whether it's that they think when they return home they'll be like ghosts, they won't be full people anymore because of what they've experienced. And they look around their house, and it finishes by saying shutters and doors all closed. So they feel shut out of things, they feel forgotten, and all they can do is turn away from this flashback and turn back to dying. And this, like, second to last stanza, this is all about God, really. And it says here, God's invincible spring, our love is made afraid. So love has turned to fear for these soldiers. And this line here would have been very powerful at the time. Love of God seems dying. Still a very religious time that Owen was writing in. A lot of the poems encouraging people, a lot of the propaganda, the posters encouraging people to come to war would have said, do it for your king and for God and your country. And this is Owen essentially saying, none of us believe in God anymore. No God out there would ever do this, would ever let this happen to people. So this stanza is all about him questioning his and maybe the other soldiers' belief in God. And the final stanza is talking about how, again, tonight the frost will come and it fix itself on us. And the burying party will go out into no man's land, pick up all the dead bodies, and then have to bring them back for burying. And it finishes by saying, all their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. So we return back to that line that we'll think about in a bit more detail in just a moment. So through that, you can see that the poem really does question the purpose of war and how pointless it seems to these soldiers, and also shows the power of nature. So let's think about these two central arguments with a little bit more detail on the language that the poet uses. So let's start with the power of nature. When it opens with our brains ache, firstly, opening with our definitely shows that everybody's feeling that way, or at least that's what Owen thinks, and that's what he feels. And when it says their brains ache, that's quite unexpected, because we'd think they'd be physically aching and tired, but actually they're exhausted and mentally in pain. That's where their suffering is coming from here. And it's because the winds knife them. That's a really aggressive verb, and it conveys how dangerous the weather is. They feel violently attacked by the wind. And another moment where we see the power of nature is this metaphor that dawn is an army. So like I said, dawn is usually a beautiful time, but actually they feel like it's another attack. They feel like it's an army coming towards them, and it just means more fighting and more chance of death. So there's absolutely nothing hopeful about the dawn for these soldiers. And attacks once more in ranks on ranks. That a rank is like a group of soldiers, so the first rank and then the next rank and the next rank. So it shows that the attack is endless and the soldiers can never escape it. And then let's think about this central argument. The poem questions the purpose of war and its futility. Now, this is a very interesting simile that Owen uses here. He says, like a dull rumour of some other war. So this simile just really shows you how the soldiers no longer feel connected to war. So maybe they feel like mentally disconnected, or they're more focused on just having to fight the weather. But to them, this war doesn't really seem like it matters anymore. It's just a rumour to them. Almost like they've been there so long it doesn't feel real anymore, maybe, or they've just grown so used to it. And that phrase there, that some other war, like I said, there's no sense of patriotism left. There's no fight for your king, fight for your country, your country needs you. There's none of that left anymore. It's just some war, doesn't really matter. And we touched on this briefly. Shutters and doors all closed, on us the doors are closed. So those shutters and doors, that imagery, it shows how the soldiers feel disconnected from their families and maybe shut out by the government. So they can't understand why the government are making the decisions that are being made, why they're still there, and they feel abandoned, really. And that's just emphasised by the repetition of closed, shows how they all feel let down, and it's like they're being left to die. Everybody's closed the doors on them and has just forgotten about them. Oh, and this very sad image to end the poem on, pause over half-known faces. This is when the burying party have gone out into no man's land to collect the dead bodies. This could show how the dead men never really got a chance to be known, because a lot of soldiers were very young. If they died young, then they lost the chance to grow and really be known. And you could think about that full stop. So remember, caesura is full stop in the middle of a line. It highlights the end of their life. Maybe you could say that, the abrupt an untimely end of their life there. Ooh. And then it says, all their eyes are ice. So it could mean the dead men's eyes are literally, like they've literally gone cold. Or it could be the soldiers that are burying them who feel empty and cold because of the war. So just at the end of every day, they go out and like collect their dead friends and bury them. It's made them cold and empty inside. Nothing shocks them anymore. And finally, let's have a little think about the structure. So I mentioned before the repetition of but nothing happens. And this could show multiple things. So it firstly could just show the amount of time soldiers spend doing nothing and just waiting. That kind of boring, repetitive nature of war. Or it could be a reference to the government who did nothing to stop the suffering of the soldiers. Remember I said that Owen did write poems, and he wrote this poem to try and expose the reality of war and kind of point a finger at the government. And it could also show the building frustration and the hopelessness of the situation. And that's why the final line of the poem is, but nothing happens, because it feels hopeless to them. All right, now over to you. So it's time to test your knowledge. Pick one of the essay questions below and answer it using the quotations that I've explored in this video. So how does Owen present the power of nature? How does Owen convey the futility or pointlessness of war? Or the shine question is, how does the title exposure link to the message of Owen's poem? Okay, pause the video, have a look at one of those questions, write it up and send it to your teacher. Then tune in for the next video.